Imagine the exact moment you realize your intuition was right, but your politeness has already sealed your fate. We like to think we have a sixth sense for danger, a primitive alarm system that triggers when a predator enters our orbit. But the truth is much more terrifying. We are social creatures, conditioned from birth to be helpful, to be agreeable, and to avoid making a scene at all costs. We would rather walk into the mouth of a literal grave than risk offending a stranger who seems, on the surface, to be doing us a favor. That split second of hesitation? That's not just a feeling. That's the sound of the trap snapping shut. The night air was a physical weight, thick with the kind of humid pre-storm stillness that makes your skin feel too tight for your body. The streetlights on this stretch of the highway were spaced too far apart, casting long, sickly orange pools of light that barely touched the edges of the encroaching pine forest. Sarah stood on the gravel shoulder, her thumb extended, not because she was reckless, but because she was desperate. Her car sat 3 miles back with a dead alternator and a phone that had breathed its last breath 20 minutes ago. In the modern world, being without a charge is like being stripped of your armor. You feel naked. You feel visible. When the headlights finally crested the hill, they weren't the aggressive, blinding high beams of a semi-truck or the flickering lanterns of an old junker. They were steady, reliable. The vehicle slowed down with a measured, rhythmic deceleration that suggested a driver who was calm, composed, and in no particular hurry. It was a dark SUV, charcoal or navy. It was hard to tell under the sodium lamps. The kind of car that screams middle-class stability. It was the kind of car a father drives. As the window slid down, the first thing that hit her wasn't a scent of decay or the smell of something off. It was the smell of vanilla. A cheap, hanging air freshener shaped like a tree, dangling from the rear-view mirror. It was so aggressively normal, it was disarming. The driver looked unremarkable. That's the word she would later scream in her mind over and over again. He wasn't a monster from a movie. He had a soft face, slightly thinning hair, and wore a polo shirt that looked like it had been pressed that morning. He offered a smile. Not a grin, but a polite, weary curve of the lips that said, "I've had a long day too, and I see you're in trouble." "Need a lift? It's a long walk to the next station, and the rain is about 5 minutes away," he said. His voice was a gentle baritone, devoid of any predatory edge. Sarah hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, her brain weighed the options. Stay in the dark and wait for a storm, or take the seat in the climate-controlled cabin with the man who smelled like vanilla. She chose the cabin. She chose the warmth. She chose the trap. The door closed with a heavy, expensive thud. The sound was final. As she buckled her seatbelt, the click echoed in the small space, sounding more like a deadbolt sliding into place than a safety feature. "I'm Mark," he said, pulling back onto the asphalt. He didn't pull away fast. He didn't peel rubber. He just merged back into the silence of the highway with the grace of a professional. For the first few miles, the conversation was the standard script of a rideshare. Where was she headed? What happened to the car? How long had she been waiting? Mark listened with an intensity that felt, at first, like genuine empathy. He nodded at the right times. He made small, self-deprecating jokes about his own car troubles in the past. But then, the texture of the silence began to change. You know that feeling when you're in a room and you suddenly realize the person next to you has stopped blinking? Sarah noticed it when she glanced sideways to thank him for the water bottle he offered. A sealed, brand-name bottle he'd pulled from the center console. He wasn't looking at the road anymore. Well, his eyes were forward, but his focus was inward. He was vibrating. Not physically, but there was an energy coming off him, a low-frequency hum of sheer electric adrenaline that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You have very steady hands," he said. It was a non sequitur, a weird, jagged edge in an otherwise smooth conversation. Sarah looked down at her lap. Her hands were gripped tight around her purse. "Oh, I guess. Just a bit nervous about the car, you know?" "No," Mark said, his voice dropping an octave, losing that helpful neighbor veneer. "I mean, you're calm. Most people in your position would be talking more, filling the space. You're a thinker. I like that. I like people who process things before they react." The way he said process felt cold. It felt clinical. She reached for the door handle, just a subconscious check, a twitch of her fingers to ensure the exit was still there. Her heart gave a sudden, violent kick against her ribs. The child's safety locks were engaged. She knew this because she could see the lack of a manual pin on the doorframe, and when she subtly pulled the lever, it moved with a limp, disconnected resistance. "Is something wrong with the air?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray her. "It feels a bit tight in here." Mark didn't look at her. He reached over and turned the child lock override on the driver's side armrest. You could hear the electronic whir of the motors. He wasn't hiding it anymore. He wanted her to know. He wanted to see the exact moment the realization broke over her face like a wave of ice water. "The air is fine, Sarah," he whispered. He used her name. She hadn't told him her name. She searched her memory frantically. Had she mentioned it? Had she left her ID visible? No. Her purse was closed. Her phone was dead. They were miles from the nearest turnoff now, and the forest on either side of the road had turned into a solid wall of black. The SUV began to accelerate, not to a dangerous speed, but to a pace that made the idea of jumping out, if she could even get the door open, seem like a death sentence. "How do you know my name?" she asked, the politeness finally stripped away, replaced by the raw, jagged edge of terror. Mark turned his head then. He didn't look at the road. He looked directly at her, his eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the green glow of the dashboard lights. He looked like a man who had just won a long, exhausting game. "I know a lot of things, Sarah. I know you were at the gas station 3 towns back. I know you like your coffee black. I know you've been looking for a reason to feel alive. And I think tonight is the night you finally get what you've been looking for." The car didn't turn toward the city. It veered right onto a logging road that wasn't even marked on a map. The smooth asphalt gave way to jarring gravel, and the vanilla scent of the air freshener suddenly felt nauseating, like perfume on a corpse. The predator had stopped mimicking a human. The mask hadn't just slipped. He had taken it off and tossed it out the window. Now, there was only the sound of the tires crunching on bone-dry rocks and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who had been waiting for this exact passenger for a very, very long time. The gravel beneath the tires changed from a rhythmic crunch to a violent, erratic spray of stones as the SUV dove deeper into the mouth of the wilderness. The transition was visceral. The smooth, curated safety of the highway was gone, replaced by the chaotic vibration of a path that hadn't seen a maintenance crew in decades. Sarah felt every jolt in her teeth. The dashboard clock glowed a haunting radioactive green. 1:42 a.m. A time when the rest of the world was tucked under blankets, oblivious to the fact that a life was being unspooled in the dark. Mark's posture had shifted. He was no longer leaning back with the casual ease of a commuter. He was gripped over the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the narrow corridor carved out by his high beams. The light hit the trunks of the pines, making them look like the bars of a cage that stretched on for infinity. He wasn't just driving, he was hunting for a specific spot, a sanctuary of silence where screams would be swallowed by the moss and the damp earth. "You're wondering about the name, aren't you?" he said, his voice now stripped of its artificial warmth. It was flat, monotone, the sound of a man reading a grocery list. "It's the digital footprint, Sarah. We think we're invisible, but we leave ghosts everywhere. A credit card swipe at a pump, a social media check-in, a loyalty card for a sandwich shop. I didn't choose you tonight by accident. I've been watching the pattern. I knew your car was failing. I saw the smoke from the exhaust 2 days ago. I knew you'd take this shortcut to avoid the construction on the 402. I just had to be the one who was there when the metal finally gave up. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a choreographed performance. He had engineered the circumstances of her vulnerability. She looked at the center console, the bottle of water. She hadn't drank from it yet. Thank God. Was it laced? Was it meant to make her compliant, or merely to keep her conscious enough to feel the fear? "What do you want?" she whispered, the words catching in a throat that felt like it was lined with sandpaper. Mark let out a short, dry chuckle. Want? That's such a primitive way to look at it. People think men like me want things. They think it's about power or some twisted release. But it's much more academic than that, Sarah. I'm interested in the threshold, the exact millisecond where a person stops being a someone, a person with a job and a favorite song and a mother who worries about them, and becomes a something, a collection of survival instincts. I want to see you stripped of your civilization. I want to see what's left when the lights go out. He suddenly slammed on the brakes. The SUV lurched forward, throwing Sarah against her seatbelt with a force that bruised her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. The engine was still idling, a low, predatory growl that vibrated through the floorboards. But the movement had stopped. They were parked in a clearing where the trees leaned inward, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. "Check the door again," he said softly. "Please," she sobbed, the first tear finally breaking free. "Please, I have money. I won't say anything. I'll just walk away. My family—" "Don't do the family speech," he interrupted, his voice snapping like a whip. "It's a cliché. It bores me. Your father is a retired accountant. Your sister lives in Seattle. I know. It doesn't make you more real to me. It just makes you more predictable. Now, check the door. I want you to understand the physics of your situation." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She pulled. Nothing. She tried to hit the unlock button on the armrest, but the plastic was dead. Mark had disconnected the electrical circuit to the passenger side. She was sealed in a reinforced steel box with a man who viewed her as a laboratory specimen. He turned toward her in the cramped space. In the dim light of the cabin, his features seemed to melt. The nice guy face was gone. His eyes were hollowed out by shadows, and he moved with a slow, agonizing deliberateness. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a heavy canvas roll. When he unrolled it on his lap, the sound of metal clinking against metal sent a surge of pure electric terror through her veins. Scalpels, zip ties, a heavy-duty roll of industrial duct tape, and a small handheld camcorder. "The camera is for the legacy," he explained, holding it up like a holy relic. "Memory is a fickle thing. It fades. It rounds off the sharp edges of the experience. But film? Film captures the purity of the moment. It captures the way your pupils dilate when you realize there is no one coming to save you. There is no hero in this story, Sarah. There's just the observer and the observed." He picked up the roll of tape. The screech of the adhesive being pulled back was the most violent sound she had ever heard. It echoed in the small cabin, a herald of the binding to come. "I'm going to open your door now," he said, leaning closer until she could smell the stale coffee on his breath beneath the synthetic vanilla of the air freshener. "But before I do, I want you to look out there." He pointed to the blackness beyond the window. "There are 40 square miles of dense timber between us and the nearest paved road. If you run, you will trip. You will break an ankle in the dark. You will die of exposure before the sun comes up. Or you can stay here and we can finish the experiment together. One way or another, Sarah, you aren't leaving this forest. The only choice you have left is how much of yourself you lose before the end." He reached over her, his arm brushing against her shoulder. a casual, terrifying intimacy, and manually unlatched the door from the outside through the open window he had just rolled down. The cold, wet air of the forest rushed in, smelling of rot and ancient earth. "Step out," he commanded. Sarah looked at the dark woods. They looked like a graveyard. Then she looked at the man with the tape and the camera. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might actually burst. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. This was the threshold he spoke of, the moment where the girl who worked in an office and paid her taxes died, and the animal took over. She stepped out into the mud. Her heels sank deep into the mire. The rain began to fall then, not a light drizzle, but a heavy, punishing downpour that turned the world into a gray blur. Mark stepped out of the driver's side, the camcorder already gripped in his right hand, the red record light blinking like a demonic eye in the darkness. He didn't rush. He walked around the hood of the car, the headlights illuminating his silhouette, making him look like a giant, a shadow king of this forgotten place. "Run," he whispered, a thin, ecstatic smile touching his lips. "Give me something worth filming." Sarah didn't scream. She knew now that screaming was a waste of oxygen. She turned and bolted into the trees, the branches tearing at her clothes, the thorns slicing her skin. Behind her, she heard the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of a man who wasn't running. He was pacing. He was following the scent of her fear. Every time she thought she had gained distance, she would see it. The beam of his high-powered flashlight cutting through the trees, always at the same distance, always steady. He was hurting her. He was pushing her toward something. She reached a ravine, the ground falling away into a slick, muddy slope. She slid down, her fingernails clawing at the earth, filling with grit and blood. At the bottom, she lay gasping, her lungs burning, her vision swimming. The rain was washing the blood from her face, but it couldn't wash away the sound of the footsteps above. He stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at her. The flashlight beam hit her square in the eyes, blinding her. "You're doing great, Sarah," he called out over the roar of the rain. "Most of them give up at the 300-yard mark, but you have a real spark. It's almost a shame to extinguish it." Almost. He began to descend, sliding down the slope with a controlled, predatory grace. Sarah scrambled backward, her hands hitting something cold and hard. A rock. A heavy, jagged piece of granite half buried in the mud. For the first time since she stepped into that SUV, a different kind of heat flared up in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, crystalline rage. If she was going to become something tonight, she wouldn't be the victim he had rehearsed for. She gripped the rock, her knuckles aching, and waited for the light to get closer. She waited for the moment he would reach out with those steady, vanilla-scented hands. "That's it," Mark said. Now only a few feet away, the camera held high to capture the finale. "Show me what's left, Sarah. Show me the animal." The rock in Sarah's hand was cold, slick with rain and mud, but it pulsed with a sudden primal warmth. It was no longer just a stone. It was a weapon, a declaration. The rage that had flared in her chest wasn't a blind, uncontrollable heat, but a focused, chilling resolve. Every nerve ending, every overtaxed muscle, every ragged breath coalesced into a single terrifying purpose: survival. She was no longer running from him. She was preparing to fight him. This was the transformation Mark had spoken of, but not the one he anticipated. He wanted to see her stripped of humanity, reduced to a whimpering animal. She would show him an animal, but one with teeth. Mark's final words, "Show me the animal," hung in the air, mocking and inciting. He took another step forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The beam of the camcorder's light was relentless, a spotlight on her despair, a theatrical flourish to his twisted narrative. He was so engrossed in capturing the moment, so confident in her complete surrender, that he overlooked the subtle shift in her posture, the tightening of her grip. He saw a cornered creature, but failed to see the venom gathering behind its eyes. Just as he raised his free hand, reaching for her, a gesture that was both threatening and possessive, Sarah lunged. It wasn't graceful or practiced. It was a desperate, guttural explosion of energy. The rock, heavy and unbalanced, connected with a sickening thud against the side of his head. He hadn't expected it. The shock on his face was instantaneous, replacing the predatory smirk with a flicker of bewildered pain. The camcorder tumbled from his grasp, hitting the muddy ground with a dull crack, the red recording light blinking its final, desperate gasp before flickering out. Mark staggered back, a low grunt escaping his lips. He put a hand to his temple, his fingers coming away sticky with dark blood that glistened under the remaining dashboard lights of the distant SUV. The illusion of his invincibility had been shattered, and with it, a part of Sarah's paralyzing fear began to recede, replaced by a surge of terrifying, exhilarating momentum. This wasn't over. One blow wouldn't stop him. She knew that. He was bigger, stronger, and fundamentally unhinged. But she had bought herself a fraction of a second, a sliver of advantage. She didn't wait. Before he could recover, before his eyes could refocus on her, she scrambled past him, up the muddy slope of the ravine. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins was a powerful, if temporary, anesthetic. As she reached the top, she didn't look back. She plunged deeper into the forest, not toward the distant glow of the highway, but sideways, creating an erratic, unpredictable path. She used the dense undergrowth, the tangled branches, and the slick, uneven terrain as her allies. Every stumble, every scraped knee, every tear in her clothes was a strategic maneuver designed to slow him down, to break his rhythm, to make him lose sight of the easy target he believed her to be. The rain continued to fall in sheets, turning the forest floor into a treacherous swamp. The sounds of her own labored breathing, the frantic thumping of her heart, and the relentless drumming of the rain drowned out everything else. Until, through the deluge, she heard it. A roar. A sound of pure, unadulterated fury that ripped through the quiet night. He was coming. And now, he wasn't just hunting. He was enraged. She ran until her legs threatened to give out, until the world spun in a dizzying vortex of green and black. She ran until she found herself at the edge of a different kind of clearing, not the neatly manicured kind, but a jagged, chaotic scar in the earth where a lightning strike had felled a cluster of ancient oaks. Their gnarled roots clawed at the air, and their shattered trunks lay like colossal bones, offering both obstacles and potential cover. She ducked behind one of the largest fallen trees, its bark rough and damp against her cheek. She pressed herself against the cold wood, trying to regulate her breathing, to listen past the chaotic thrum of her own terror. The darkness here was absolute, broken only by the sporadic flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the scene like a macabre stage. In those fleeting moments, she saw the silhouette of Mark moving through the trees, no longer controlled, no longer methodical. He was crashing through the undergrowth, swearing under his breath, a wounded beast seeking retribution. He wasn't using the flashlight anymore. He was relying on the ambient light, or perhaps the primal instinct of a predator on the scent. His movements were less precise, more desperate. The blows she had landed had disoriented him, and in this treacherous terrain, that was a significant advantage. Sarah slowly, cautiously, peered around the edge of the fallen oak. She could hear him getting closer, his heavy footsteps squelching in the mud. He was talking to himself now, a low, guttural monologue she couldn't quite decipher, but the tone was unmistakable, venomous, obsessed. Then, he paused, just meters from her hiding spot. She held her breath, every muscle in her body screaming with tension. She could feel his presence, a tangible wave of malevolence radiating through the damp air. He was listening. He was waiting. He knew she was close. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice hoarse, no longer the calm baritone. "You thought you could fight back. You thought you could change the script. Foolish girl. This was always going to end one way. The question is, how much more pain do you want to experience before you accept your role?" He took another step, then another, circling the clearing, his eyes scanning the shadows. He wasn't looking for her anymore. He was hunting her. The distinction was subtle, but critical. He wasn't trying to capture her gently. He was trying to corner her. Suddenly, a massive clap of thunder ripped through the sky, followed by a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the entire clearing. For a split second, Sarah saw him perfectly. His face contorted with rage, the dark stain of blood on his temple, his hands clenched into fists. And she saw something else, just beyond him. A faint, flickering light through the dense trees. Not the harsh beam of a flashlight, but a diffused, yellowish glow. It was far away, barely perceptible, but it was there. Hope. A dangerous, intoxicating spark. She didn't know what it was. A farmhouse? Another car broken down? It didn't matter. It was a direction, a chance. But to get to it, she would have to cross the clearing, exposing herself. She would have to move past Mark, who was still circling, still searching. She waited for another crack of thunder, for the precise moment when the sound would mask her movements. When it came, a deafening explosion that vibrated through the earth. She moved. Not a mad dash, but a calculated burst. She scrambled from behind the tree, not directly towards the light, but angling away from Mark, using the chaotic geometry of the fallen oaks as cover. He heard her. Oh, he heard her. "Bitch!" he screamed, and the sound was so animalistic, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. He lunged in her direction, crashing through the undergrowth, his pursuit no longer a careful stalk, but a desperate, furious charge. She was faster now, fueled by the terrifying proximity of his rage and the tantalizing promise of that distant light. She could feel the ground shaking with his heavy footsteps behind her. She could almost feel his breath on her neck. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain, through the fear, through the sheer impossibility of it all. The light was getting stronger now, a steady beacon in the oppressive darkness. It wasn't just a flicker, it was a consistent glow, hinting at something more than a single bulb. A building. A chant. She burst through the last line of trees, stumbling out into another, larger clearing. And there it was. Not a farmhouse, but an old, dilapidated hunting cabin, its windows glowing with a soft, inviting light. A generator hummed somewhere nearby, a sound that, to Sarah, was more beautiful than any symphony. But Mark was right behind her. As she cleared the tree line, she heard the definitive sound of his heavy hand connecting with her shoulder, spinning her around. She lost her footing, falling hard onto the muddy ground, the wind knocked out of her. He stood over her, breathing heavily, his face contorted into a triumphant, terrifying grin, blood still oozing from his temple. "Got you," he wheezed, his eyes gleaming with a sick, possessive satisfaction. He raised his fist, the shadow of his hand blotting out the light from the cabin windows. "Now we finish this." The cabin stood there like a phantom, a rotting monument of cedar and rusted tin, leaking light through cracks in its shutters. To anyone else, it would look like the setting of a horror film, but to Sarah, it was a fortress. It was the only thing standing between her and the void. Mark stood over her, his shadow cast long and distorted by the cabin's amber glow. He looked less like a man now, and more like a ruptured husk, his polo shirt torn, his face a mask of dried gore and fresh rain. He wasn't talking anymore. The intellectual pretenses, the experiments, the talk of thresholds. It had all burned away, leaving only the white-hot core of a wounded ego. He reached down, his fingers locking around her throat. The pressure was immediate and agonizing. Sarah's vision began to spark, little bursts of white light dancing at the edges of the blackness. This was it. This was the something he wanted to see. But as the air was cut off, as her lungs burned with a fire that felt like liquid lead, that cold, crystalline rage from the ravine returned with a vengeance. She didn't claw at his face. She didn't plead. She reached into the mud beside her, her fingers searching for anything, a branch, a shard of glass, a discarded tool. Her hand closed around a heavy, rusted iron spike, a remnant of some forgotten construction or a broken piece of the cabin's foundation. With the last of her strength, as the world began to fade into a dull, gray hum, she drove the iron upward. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for the soft, vulnerable space beneath his jaw. The sound was wet, a sickening, muffled puncturing of flesh. Mark's eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks. The pressure on her throat vanished as he recoiled, making a sound like a drowning man trying to scream. He fell back into the mud, clutching his throat, his hands instantly becoming slick with a dark, pulsing crimson that looked black under the cabin light. Sarah scrambled backward, gasping for air, her throat feeling like it had been crushed by a vice. She didn't wait to see if he would get up. She forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking so violently she could barely stand, and threw herself toward the cabin door. She slammed into the wood, her hands fumbling for the latch. It was heavy, iron-bound, and for a terrifying second, it wouldn't budge. She looked back over her shoulder. Mark was on his knees, a silhouette of nightmare, swaying back and forth. He was still holding the iron spike in his neck, a macabre crown of his own making. He was trying to stand. The sheer, unnatural willpower of the man was more terrifying than the weapon itself. The door gave way with a screech of rusted hinges. Sarah fell inside, the smell of old wood, kerosene, and wood smoke hitting her like a physical wall. She didn't look around. She slammed the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt just as a heavy thud vibrated through the wood. He was outside. He was throwing his weight against the door. Thud, thud. Each impact felt like it was hitting her spine. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room. The cabin was small, a single room filled with shadows. A wood stove sat in the corner, still radiating a dying heat. On a workbench against the far wall, she saw it, the source of the generator's power. A small radio was crackling with static, and beside it, a heavy, long-handled wood axe. She grabbed the axe. The weight of it was grounding. It was real. It was an answer to the questions he had been asking all night. The thudding stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was the silence of a predator rethinking its approach. She heard the wet, dragging sound of footsteps moving along the exterior wall. He was looking for another way in. A window. A gap in the floorboards. "Sarah." His voice was a shredded whisper, coming through the gaps in the logs. It sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. You really did it. You found it. The spark. Do you feel it? Do you feel how close you are? To me? She didn't answer. She stood in the center of the room, the axe raised, her eyes fixed on the single, shuttered window. Suddenly, the glass shattered. A blood-slicked hand burst through the shutters, clawing at the air, searching for the latch. Sarah didn't hesitate. She swung the axe with every ounce of trauma and adrenaline left in her body. The blade bit deep into the wooden frame, missing his fingers by an inch. But the shock of the impact was enough to make him retract. "Go away!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking. "Go away or I will kill you! I'll kill you!" A wet, bubbling laugh came from the darkness outside. "You already did, Sarah. That's the point. Look at you. Look at your hands. You aren't the girl who caught the ride anymore. You're the one who stays in the woods." The footsteps moved away from the window, dragging, slower now. She heard him stumble. She heard the sound of a body hitting the porch steps. She waited. She waited for a minute, 5 minutes, 10. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the generator and the steady drum of the rain on the tin roof. The adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a crushing, soul-deep exhaustion. Her hands were cramping around the axe handle. She approached the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked through a small knothole in the wood. Mark was slumped against the railing of the porch. His head was lolled back, his eyes open, staring up at the rain. The iron spike was still there, a vertical line against the horizontal gray of the night. He wasn't moving. The red light of the camcorder, which he had somehow crawled back to and gripped in his dying moments, was still blinking. Even in death, he wanted to witness his own ending. Sarah didn't open the door. She didn't run for the car. She sat down on the floor, leaning her back against the heavy wood, the axe across her lap. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the shutters, the rain finally slowed to a drizzle. The forest began to wake up, the sound of birds, the rustle of leaves, normal sounds. Sounds of a world that didn't know what had happened in this clearing. She looked at her reflection in a dusty mirror hanging on the wall. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. The eyes were different, harder, colder, reflecting a knowledge that can never be unlearned. She had survived the ride. She had survived the woods. But as she looked at the dead man on the porch, she realized that the experiment had been a success in the most horrific way possible. He had wanted to see the animal, and she would have to live with that animal for the rest of her life. She reached out and turned off the radio. The static died. She picked up the phone on the workbench, a landline, ancient but functional. She dialed 3 digits. "Emergency," the voice said. Sarah looked at the door, at the blood on her hands, and at the blinking red light of the camera outside. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice steady and hollow. "I'm at a cabin off the old logging road. I'm calling to report a death." She hung up and waited. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat in the growing light, watching the shadow of the man who tried to break her grow shorter and shorter until the sun was high in the sky and the silence of the woods was finally, mercifully, complete. The ride was over. But the forest stayed with her.